Do you even belong here, Nathan? Brandon's voice cut through the chandelier-lit ballroom like ice against glass. The words landed, echoed, and bounced off every marble surface, reaching ears that were all too willing to laugh. I stood frozen in the doorway, adjusting my tie, palms damp beneath the cuff of my jacket. Claire was beside me, radiant in a silk emerald dress that shimmered with every movement, and yet her smile carried a flicker of amusement that stung deeper than any insult. Brandon, leaning casually against the bar, raised his glass in mock salute, his laughter mingling with that of a few board members clustered near the front, each chuckle feeling like a weight pressing on my chest. The room smelled of expensive perfume, polished wood, and the faint tang of champagne, but none of it masked the sensation of being exposed, of having every eye trace my silhouette and mark me as an outsider, as if my presence was an inconvenience to their perfect little world. I straightened my shoulders, forcing my expression into calm, even as a pulse of heat rose to my jaw. Every step I had taken to get here, every choice I had made to remain invisible while Claire's career flourished, suddenly seemed trivial. The waiter passing by nearly bumped into me, the silver tray wobbling in his grasp, and I realized I could hear every whispered snicker, every subtle nudge, as Brandon made another quip. Hope you don't trip on the way to the dessert table, Nathan. Wouldn't want to ruin the ambience. Claire's eyes flickered toward mine, and for a heartbeat I searched for a sign that she understood, that she would side with me. She didn't. Her hand brushed mine lightly in what I first thought was comfort, but it felt instead like an affirmation that she found the spectacle entertaining. The laughter swelled, the room's chandeliers casting refracted patterns across polished floors, and in that moment, I felt the old, familiar tightness of invisibility wrap around me like a second skin. I reminded myself of all the times I had chosen quiet observation over confrontation, the evenings I had fixed the plumbing in our suburban home, while Claire hosted soirees I wasn't meant to attend, the countless hours spent in silence as she navigated corporate politics with grace I would never have been expected to match. The pulse of my heartbeat matched the rhythm of the soft jazz filling the background, yet each note felt like it was accentuating the humiliation instead of masking it. Brandon's smirk widened as he leaned into the group. Didn't think you'd even show, did you? I mean, it's cute how you try, but, his words trailed, leaving the implication hanging heavy in the air. I took a slow breath, allowing the image of him, Claire, and every amused face to crystallize in my mind. My eyes scanned the room, noting every detail, the glint of crystal, the texture of the carpet, the tilt of chandeliers catching the low light, the way shadows danced across their faces, and I understood fully how they saw me, a man misplaced, insignificant, peripheral. Yet beneath that calm exterior, a plan was already taking shape. A story of patience, observation, and subtle control. A story they could not read from my posture, from the quiet click of my shoes on the polished floor, from the restrained set of my jaw. And as Brandon's laughter reached a peak, my gaze met Claire's again, steady and unwavering this time, carrying a quiet challenge she did not yet recognize. The room seemed to pause, just for a fraction, the sound of champagne glasses clinking a distant echo compared to the sudden, sharp clarity in my mind. They had assumed I was powerless, that I was nothing more than a footnote to her career, a prop in her narrative, and for a long moment, the thought stung with undeniable accuracy. But standing there, amidst the flicker of crystal light and the muffled hum of polite conversation, I reminded myself, this was exactly the right place, the right moment, and the right audience for the revelation they would never see coming. I smiled slightly, almost imperceptibly, a quiet twitch that spoke of comprehension, control, and an understanding of the story that belonged to me as much as it did to anyone in this room. The air felt heavier, denser, yet my posture remained unshaken, my voice silent, my thoughts sharp. Every insult, every guffaw, every glance that marked me as an outsider was cataloged, noted, stored. Because this wasn't just a gala. It was a stage, and I had long ago learned the choreography, the timing, and the steps necessary to turn observation into power. Nathan Whitaker had always been underestimated, and tonight, that misjudgment was about to become their blind spot, the very leverage that would eventually shift the entire balance of this meticulously constructed empire. And while the room continued to laugh, I allowed myself the smallest acknowledgement of satisfaction. They had no idea what was coming. By the time the applause for the next award presentation rolled through the ballroom, I had already stepped away from the circle near the bar and found a quieter place beside the tall windows overlooking downtown Chicago. 30 floors below, headlights moved along Michigan Avenue like thin white threads, orderly and distant, while behind me the gala kept shining as if nothing unpleasant had happened. That was the strange thing about public humiliation. The room moved on before your chest did. People laughed, lifted glasses, checked their phones, adjusted cuff links, and returned to polite conversation, while you stood there holding the bruise no one else could see. I watched my reflection in the glass. A 42-year-old man in a charcoal suit Claire had told me was fine enough, brown hair touched with gray near the temples, clean shoes, plain watch, no designer logo anywhere. I looked like exactly what they thought I was. A quiet husband, a harmless man, the kind of man who carried garment bags, remembered dinner reservations, and knew which brand of almond milk his wife preferred. Maybe that was why they had no problem laughing. People rarely feel guilty about stepping over someone they have already decided belongs on the floor. Claire did not come after me right away. That told me more than any apology could have. She stayed near Brandon Pierce, one hand around a champagne flute, her posture perfect, her smile polished, her voice light enough to float above the music. I had seen that version of her for years, the corporate version, the woman who could make a room lean toward her with a single sentence. I used to admire it. I used to tell myself she had earned every inch of that confidence. And she had. Claire was smart, disciplined, ruthless when the job required it, and graceful when people were watching. But somewhere along the way, she had started treating me like something that did not fit the image. At home, I was useful. I changed air filters, managed bills, took her car to the dealership, kept the pantry stocked, and waited up when late meetings ran past 10. In public, I became a loose thread she wanted tucked away. The shift had not happened all at once. It never does. It started with little corrections. Do not wear that jacket, Nathan. Try not to talk about the house repairs tonight. Let me introduce you, and just keep it simple. At first, I laughed because marriage has a way of teaching men to swallow small things to protect big ones. Then the small things became habits. She stopped saying my full name at events and started calling me my husband, in the same tone people use for an old umbrella. She stopped asking what I thought about her company and started telling people I was not really a business person. She said it sweetly, with a smile, as if sugar could soften the insult. I let it pass. I had my reasons. 15 years earlier, before Vanguard Meridian had glass offices, charity galas, and executives who used words like synergy with straight faces, it had been a sinking Midwestern logistics firm with bad debt, tired leadership, and 300 employees wondering if their paychecks would clear. Claire had been a rising manager then, brilliant and hungry, still driving a used Honda Civic with a cracked windshield. She would come home exhausted, kick off her heels by the door, and talk about how the company could be saved if someone with real capital and patience stepped in. She never knew I listened as closely as I did. She never knew I made calls after she fell asleep. She never knew the first bridge loan came through a holding company with a name she would not recognize. I did not do it for applause. I did it because I believed in her, and because I had already learned that the loudest person in the room is rarely the one holding the strongest position. My money came from patents, early investments, and one acquisition that changed my life before I turned 35. I did not hide it out of shame. I hid it because money changes the temperature of every conversation. People stop asking who you are and start calculating what you are worth. Claire knew I had done well. She did not know how well. I gave her comfort without spectacle, security without making myself the center of it. A paid-off house in Oak Brook. No credit card balances. Vacations she assumed came from careful budgeting. A safety net she never had to see. I thought that was love. Quiet provision. Steady hands. No scoreboard. But as I stood by that window, listening to Brandon's laughter rise again behind me, I realized quiet love can become invisible if the person receiving it decides not to look closely. Claire finally appeared beside me, her perfume arriving before her voice. "You are being too sensitive," she said softly, eyes still on the room instead of on me. There it was. Not concern. Not embarrassment. Management. I turned from the glass and looked at her, really looked at her, at the woman I had spent years protecting from storms she never knew had passed over her roof. He embarrassed you, she continued, lowering her voice. Do not make it worse by acting wounded. Something inside me settled then. Not anger, not even sadness. Something colder and clearer. I glanced past her shoulder toward Brandon, who was now leaning close to Richard Langford, both men smiling as if the night belonged to them. Richard looked up for half a second and caught my eyes. His smile faded first. He remembered what Claire had forgotten. He knew the name behind the structure. He knew why the company had survived. Claire followed my gaze, confused by the change in Richard's face, but she still did not understand. Not yet. I slipped my hand into my jacket pocket and felt the smooth edge of my phone. One message from Marcus Hale waited on the screen, simple and precise. Everything is ready when you are. I looked back at Claire and gave her the calmest smile I had worn all evening. You are right, I said. I should not make it worse. Then I walked back toward the laughter, not because I belonged to their world, but because I had finally decided to stop letting them believe it belonged to them. As I moved away from the window, the soft hum of the jazz ensemble filled the corners of the ballroom, each note a reminder that the evening would continue whether I stood humiliated or not. Nathan Whitaker, they thought, was harmless, a man who knew his place beside the success of his wife, Claire, but nothing more. I observed quietly, noting the tilt of Brandon Pierce's shoulders, the way his laugh carried across the polished marble, and the subtle adjustments of Claire's posture as she navigated the crowd with practiced elegance. Every hand extended in greeting, every glass lifted in toast, became data, cataloged silently in my mind. I remembered the first time I had met Claire in a cramped lecture hall years ago, her notebook filled with carefully scrawled ideas, eyes sharp and voice certain even when explaining concepts to the room. Back then, she had been fearless, energetic, the kind of woman who commanded attention without even asking for it. I had seen potential in her that few others recognized, and I had decided quietly, strategically, that I would be the support she needed without ever revealing the extent of my resources. The gala, with its chandeliers and murmurs of polite conversation, was a far cry from that room, yet the lesson remained. Perception often outweighs reality. I took a slow, deliberate step toward the main floor, careful to keep my movement measured and calm, observing the way the light caught the edges of glassware, the glint in Brandon's watch as he gestured toward the new hires, the subtle arch of Claire's eyebrow when she noticed a compliment I had overheard whispered in passing. Every detail was a thread in a web that I had been weaving for years, a network of influence, patience, and unseen control. The floor beneath my polished shoes felt solid, grounding me as my mind worked, tracing lines of ownership, trust agreements, and the silent scaffolding of a company Claire had assumed was entirely hers to command. I could recall the nights spent reviewing corporate filings, the quiet phone calls to lawyers and trustees, the hidden minutes where decisions were logged without fanfare, but with precision that would become evident when the time was right. Claire did not need to know, Brandon did not need to know, Richard Langford did not yet know. They were actors on a stage, and I had long since learned the importance of letting the performance play out. A smile flickered across my lips, subtle, almost imperceptible, because it was not meant for anyone else but for myself. The knowledge of patience, the understanding of timing, and the assurance that the narrative could be redirected with careful, deliberate actions gave me a quiet satisfaction. I sipped the water from my glass, letting the cool clarity remind me of the distance I had maintained between perception and truth. Brandon approached, confident, unaware that the laughter and dismissive gestures he had deployed as weapons against me would soon be the tools revealing his own miscalculations. Claire followed, her heels clicking lightly, the sound precise against the marble, each step a rhythmic signal of her control in social situations. I noted her every motion, not with jealousy, but with an understanding of the dynamics I had once admired. The crowd parted subtly as we approached, the murmurs continuing without pause. People invested in the scene without realizing that the invisible hand guiding the narrative belonged to the very man they were mocking. I held my posture steady, voice silent, expression controlled, because the eventual shift in the evening would hinge not on loud proclamations, but on the meticulous arrangement of facts, documents, and timing that only I knew existed. The chandeliers above reflected in my eyes, 1,000 tiny lights, each representing an observer unaware of the hidden influence I had long maintained. I allowed a pause, letting a small ripple of acknowledgement pass through the space between Claire and myself, a silent question and answer that required no words. Brandon laughed again, confidently, yet a subtle shift in the air suggested that even he was beginning to feel the undercurrent, the weight of a man underestimated. Quietly organizing the future around the edges of a room designed for spectacle. I adjusted the cuff of my jacket once more, checked the alignment of my tie, and prepared mentally for the next sequence, knowing that the evening would unfold in my favor if I simply maintained observation, patience, and the quiet readiness that had always been my strategy. As the evening continued, I let my gaze sweep across the room once more, noting the subtle shifts in posture and expression that betrayed how each guest was invested in the scene without truly understanding the underlying currents. Nathan Whitaker had learned long ago that appearances are both armor and trap, and in this room, the armor of invisibility had served me well, keeping my presence underestimated while I observed, cataloged, and calculated every micro-interaction. Claire moved from group to group with her usual precision, shaking hands, exchanging pleasantries, and laughing at the right intervals, her eyes catching the ambient light and reflecting confidence that had been carefully constructed over years of practice. Yet beneath the surface, small cracks revealed themselves in gestures she thought unnoticed. A brief hesitation when responding to a compliment, a flicker of recognition in her glance toward me, a subtle tightening of her jaw when Brandon leaned too close in mock camaraderie. I allowed my attention to dwell on these details, each one a note in a symphony of observations that would inform the next steps in a sequence I had been orchestrating quietly for over a decade. The music shifted subtly, a soft crescendo that drew conversations into smaller clusters and allowed pockets of sound to become nearly private, carrying snippets of laughter and commentary that fed into my analysis. I remembered the countless nights I had spent in offices with dim lighting, reviewing documents and corporate records while Claire worked tirelessly on strategy and operations, a partnership she never fully acknowledged because she assumed I existed outside the frame of significance. Those nights had built a foundation of knowledge and control invisible to everyone else, and the time had come for that foundation to be positioned strategically, without alarm or drama, before anyone realized what was happening. Brandon, confident and unaware, continued his performance, boasting lightly about recent achievements and joking about the company culture as though it were a stage upon which he alone performed. Every inflection of his voice, every sway of his stance, confirmed the same assumption that had always been held about me, that I was passive, irrelevant, and entirely at the mercy of circumstances. I did not correct them. I did not even react. Silence, measured and calm, was a more powerful tool than any outburst. I let the small details speak for me. The precise alignment of my shoes, the careful adjustment of my cuff, the subtle straightening of my shoulders, as though each gesture were a calculated message that no one yet understood. A server passed near me with a tray of sparkling water, and I accepted a glass with minimal movement, the chill of the liquid grounding me as I reflected on the trajectory that had brought me to this point. The quiet moments between exchanges, the lulls in laughter and conversation, were my opportunity to measure, to plan, and to prepare. Claire glanced toward me briefly, her expression neutral, but I detected the fraction of a second where doubt flickered in her eyes. It was enough to remind me that her perception of events was limited, that she could not see the full scope of influence that had been operating quietly behind every decision, every strategic move she believed had been hers alone. I watched as she adjusted a cuff of her sleeve, smoothed the fabric of her dress, and laughed at a remark I knew she had heard many times before, but now registered with a new weight. The ballroom continued its performance, the glittering light catching in crystal glasses and polished surfaces, while I stood at the edge of the crowd, calm, observant, patient. Every whisper, every glance, every raised eyebrow was data. Every subtle movement of the executives, the board members, and her colleagues became part of a map I had been creating in my mind for years. The room's rhythm, the cadence of conversation, and the subtle hierarchy of attention told a story, one I had long ago learned to read fluently. Nathan Whitaker was present, physically understated. Yet the narrative he had quietly cultivated over years was about to shift the balance of perception entirely. I sipped my water, the cool liquid steadying my senses, allowing me to focus, to plan the next sequence with clarity. Brandon's attention turned to a different cluster, laughing at a private joke, and I noted how his energy, misplaced and unguarded, was vulnerable to redirection. Claire, for all her poise and confidence, could not yet perceive the structural advantage I held, the carefully constructed channels of influence and control that had always been in my hands, silent but absolute. And so I waited, letting the evening play out, letting the room continue unaware that the quiet observer, the underestimated presence, held the key to every movement, every decision, and every potential shift that would soon redefine the dynamics of the night and the future of the company itself. Brandon found me near the center of the ballroom 10 minutes later, right as the master of ceremonies announced a short intermission before the leadership tribute. He came with 2 vice presidents behind him and Richard Langford at his side, the kind of formation men use when they want witnesses for a joke they already think will land. Claire noticed them first. I saw the smallest change in her face, the faint tightening around her mouth, not enough to stop what was coming, just enough to know she understood Brandon was about to push too far. She could have stepped in. She could have taken my arm, changed the subject, reminded them I was her husband instead of some inconvenient prop in her corporate story. Instead, she looked down into her glass. That was the moment the room sharpened. Brandon clapped a hand near my shoulder without quite touching me, smiling wide, teeth bright under the chandelier light. "Nathan, I have to ask," he said, pitching his voice just loud enough for the nearby tables to turn. "What is your secret? Most men would feel a little outclassed in a room like this, but you just stand there like you accidentally wandered in from the valet line." A few people laughed, not loudly at first. They were testing whether it was safe. Brandon gave them permission with another grin. "I mean, Claire is closing national accounts. Richard is steering the company through expansion. The rest of us are working 80 hours a week. And you have this calm little energy like a man whose biggest decision today was whether to buy whole milk or 2%. More laughter. This time it came easier. I looked at Claire. She was smiling, but it was not the smile she used at home when something genuinely amused her. It was the public smile, the one designed to keep the room comfortable. That made it worse. A cruel joke is one thing. Your wife helping it breathe is another. Richard cleared his throat, pretending to object while enjoying the show. "Easy, Brandon," he said, but there was no steel in it. No command. Just enough restraint to protect himself if the joke soured. Brandon lifted both hands. "No disrespect. I admire it. Truly. Every powerful woman needs someone dependable at home. Somebody has to keep the porch lights on while the adults make decisions." The words did not hit all at once. They spread. They moved through the room in waves, soft at the edges, poisonous in the center. I felt every eye turn toward me, measuring how much of myself I would surrender to keep the peace. For years, I had done exactly that. I had let silence pass for dignity. I had let restraint look like weakness. I had allowed Claire to build a version of me that made her ambition easier to explain. Simple husband. Quiet man. No threat. No history worth mentioning. But that night, with Brandon standing in front of me and Claire standing beside him in everything but body, the old arrangement ended without ceremony. I set my glass on a nearby cocktail table. The sound was small, barely a click against the wood, but Richard heard it. His eyes moved to my hand, then to my face. There it was again, that quick flash of recognition, like a man noticing smoke under a locked door. Brandon missed it. Men like Brandon often miss the one signal that matters because they are too busy admiring the noise they make. "Come on, Nathan," he continued. "Tell us, what does a day in your life even look like? Do you manage Claire's calendar? Pick up dry cleaning? Make sure her coffee is ready before she goes out and saves the company?" The laughter rose again, bigger now, fattened by champagne and group permission. Someone at the nearest table covered a smile with a napkin. Someone else looked away because decency had arrived too late to be useful. Claire finally touched my wrist. Not to defend me, to control me. Her fingers pressed lightly, a silent warning that said, "Do not embarrass me." That touch moved through me like winter air under a door. I looked down at her hand, then back at Brandon. My voice, when it came, was calm enough to make the laughter thin out on its own. You seem very interested in what I do all day. Brandon chuckled. Everybody is, honestly. I nodded once. Then you should ask Richard. The smile on Richard Langford's face vanished so quickly it felt like the lights had flickered. Brandon turned toward him, still amused. Richard. The chief executive officer opened his mouth, but no answer came out. His champagne glass had stopped halfway to his lips. Claire noticed that. For the first time all evening, she really looked at Richard, then at me, then back at Richard. I did not raise my voice. I did not step closer. I simply adjusted my cuff and let the silence gather weight. Go ahead, I said. Tell him why you never approved a major acquisition without outside consent. Tell him why the expansion loan cleared in 6 hours when every bank had already said no. Tell him why the board packet always arrives on my attorney's desk before it reaches yours. The people nearest us stopped pretending not to listen. Brandon's grin bent at the edges, still present but no longer comfortable. Claire whispered my name, but it sounded different now. Not irritated. Uncertain. Richard looked as if every chandelier in the room had turned into a spotlight. I leaned slightly toward Brandon, not enough to threaten, just enough to be heard. And after he explains that, you can ask him who really owns the room you have been performing in all night. The silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt full. Full of questions. Full of panic. Full of every laugh returning to the mouths it came from and turning bitter on the tongue. After the room settled, the subtle shift in attention was palpable, though no one spoke. Nathan Whitaker remained poised, his presence quiet yet commanding, as if every movement, every measured step, carried authority that no laughter or mockery could diminish. Claire shifted slightly beside him, aware now that the energy in the room had changed, that the previous confidence in Brandon Pierce's smirk was starting to falter. I let my eyes sweep across the attendees, noting the ones who were beginning to see cracks in the story they had assumed was complete, while the hum of conversation became tentative, as though the music and chatter could not fully mask the new tension. I took a deliberate sip from the glass of water I had set down moments before, letting the cool clarity settle my senses, while my mind traced the sequence of actions I had prepared for years, every piece falling into place with precision. Marcus Hale's text, quietly received on my phone in a pocket, reminded me that all legal and financial documentation was ready, verified, and in place, awaiting the precise moment it would command attention. I could see Brandon adjusting his stance, perhaps sensing that the narrative was no longer entirely his to control, though he had no idea the extent of the structural advantage I held. Claire, still beside him, followed the changes, her smile flickering as she realized that her understanding of the evening's hierarchy had been incomplete. I let the observation settle into the room without interruption, allowing silence to carry weight. The light refracted off the crystal chandeliers, scattering into soft patterns on the polished floors, reflecting the complexity of the unspoken dynamics at play. I remembered the early days of Vanguard Meridian, when Claire had first joined as a rising manager and the company teetered on the edge of financial instability. Quietly, I had provided support, structured investments, and legal scaffolding to stabilize the operations, all without recognition, all without public acknowledgement. It was not pride that had guided me, but calculation, foresight, and patience. Those years of unseen influence had given me the capacity to steer outcomes without drawing attention, to maintain control while remaining invisible to the people who now assumed they had the upper hand. The applause for a minor award drifted through the room, nearly masking the subtle tension I had created, but I noted every reaction, every glance, and every shift in demeanor. Nathan Whitaker, they assumed, was passive, and that assumption was their blind spot. A small whisper from one of the executives, a soft comment meant to be unnoticed, traveled across the cluster and reached my ears. I cataloged it, noting the potential leverage in perception, the way a single observation could ripple outward once activated. Brandon laughed again, attempting to reassert dominance, but the effort lacked the natural ease it had before. His gestures now carried a hint of unease, a small recognition that the script he had been following did not account for Nathan Whitaker's invisible influence. Claire looked toward him, uncertainty flickering across her composed expression, and for a moment, It was clear that her trust in public appearances had blinded her to the full measure of control that had always been at my disposal. I adjusted the cuff of my suit once more, ensuring that my posture remained unshakable, my voice silent, and my expression calm. The room felt heavier, yet the weight belonged to them, to the assumptions they had made about who I was and what I could do. Every detail mattered. The placement of documents on the tables, the timing of conversations, the strategic pauses and laughter, and the subtle acknowledgments of authority in the room. Nathan Whitaker had become the pivot around which the evening would turn, and the moment to reveal the structure of his quiet control was approaching, measured and precise. I allowed myself the smallest internal acknowledgement of satisfaction, knowing that the groundwork laid over years, the silent observation, and the careful orchestration of influence would soon manifest, altering perception and control without the need for spectacle or confrontation. Every laugh, every gesture, every glass raised in perceived celebration was now part of the canvas on which the eventual shift would be painted, and I remained calm, poised, and ready, fully aware that the moment of revelation was closer than anyone in the room could imagine. The lights shifted slightly as the gala moved toward its next segment, a brief pause between awards giving me the moment I had been waiting for. Nathan Whitaker took a measured step back, letting the room settle into a false rhythm while I prepared to redirect the attention from performance to truth. Claire, still beside me, followed the subtle cues, unaware of the full measure of control that lay quietly in my hands. I could see Brandon Pierce adjusting his posture, straightening his tie, perhaps sensing for the first time that his laughter no longer carried authority. The murmurs across tables began to fluctuate, small ripples of uncertainty moving among the executives who had been so certain of the social hierarchy. Nathan Whitaker had spent years building invisible scaffolding around the company, quietly shaping policy, stabilizing investments, and maintaining oversight without recognition, and now that hidden influence was about to assert itself in plain sight. My eyes scanned the room, noting each gesture, each raised glass, each glance, as I mapped out the exact sequence to shift perception without confrontation. Claire shifted slightly, heels clicking against the marble, and I observed the precise arc of her expression as she processed what she could not yet fully see. Every step, every adjustment of cuff or jacket was deliberate, each movement calculated to maintain composure while signaling authority. I could hear the faint clink of glass and the low undertone of conversation beginning to pause, as though the room instinctively recognized that the equilibrium had changed. The early applause had faded, leaving a space dense with attention, anticipation, and the weight of expectation. Nathan Whitaker, they assumed, had been passive, a man of negligible consequence in this room filled with ambition and performance. That assumption, long nurtured and unchallenged, was about to become the leverage I would use. I remembered the years spent reviewing corporate filings, orchestrating investments, and structuring ownership without fanfare, decisions that stabilized the company while remaining invisible to all but a few. Those months of planning, quiet negotiation, and silent observation were now coming into alignment, a chain of influence that had always been present but unacknowledged. Brandon moved closer to Claire, speaking quietly, assuming a camaraderie that was no longer secure, unaware that the foundation he stood on had shifted without his knowledge. Claire, for all her poise and control, could not perceive the subtle threads of authority that Nathan held, and that momentary blindness made her complicit in the ongoing misperception. I adjusted my stance, allowed a slow exhale, and let the silence become the instrument through which attention was drawn, guiding perception while maintaining an outward calm. The chandeliers above scattered light across polished floors, reflecting every small movement, every subtle shift in posture, and I cataloged it all, storing it for the precise moment when intervention would be executed. The murmurs quieted further, as if the entire room instinctively paused, sensing the tension without knowing its source. My phone, discreetly secured in my jacket pocket, reminded me that the final pieces were in place, every document ready, every legal and financial instrument prepared for action. I let the audience linger in their assumptions, the weight of expectation pressing on them, as I stood poised at the edge of observation, fully aware that Nathan Whitaker's quiet presence, measured patience, and deliberate restraint would now shape the outcome without spectacle. Brandon's smile faltered slightly, a small crease near the corner of his eye, revealing that even the most confident gestures could betray uncertainty under pressure. Claire glanced at him, her expression caught between curiosity and concern, beginning to recognize a shift in the room's energy she could not yet interpret. I remained calm, measured, silent, and observant, knowing that the moment of revelation was approaching, precise, inevitable, and entirely controlled. Every glance, every movement, and every breath became part of the unfolding strategy, as the room unknowingly prepared to witness a redirection of power orchestrated by the man they had assumed powerless, the quiet presence whose patience and foresight would soon redefine the evening and the hierarchy that had been so confidently assumed. Richard Langford was the first man in that ballroom to understand that the evening had stopped being a social inconvenience and had become a corporate problem. I saw it in his eyes before anyone else did. His face remained composed, trained by years of investor calls and board presentations, but the color had drained from his cheeks in a way no amount of stage lighting could hide. Brandon looked between us, still trying to recover the room, still searching for the joke that would put him back on top. Men like him do not recognize danger when it arrives without noise. They expect power to announce itself with raised voices, sharp gestures, and public displays. They do not expect it to stand quietly in a charcoal suit, set down a glass of water, and ask one question that makes a chief executive officer forget how to speak. Claire stepped closer to me then, her voice low and thin. "Nathan, what is going on?" I kept my eyes on Richard. That depends on whether he wants to answer honestly. The nearest tables had gone still. The jazz band continued playing near the stage, but even that sounded distant now, like music coming from another building. Brandon gave a short laugh, but it cracked in the middle. "Richard, come on. What is this?" Richard swallowed once. He looked toward Claire, then toward the board members seated near the front, then back at me. I could almost see the calculation moving behind his eyes. Deny too much, and the documents would correct him. Admit too much, and he would lose the room before breakfast. Silence was the only place he had left to stand, and even that was shrinking. I reached into my jacket pocket and took out my phone. One tap opened the message from Marcus Hale. I did not need to read it again. I already knew every word. Final packet delivered. Board members notified. Emergency governance session. Scheduled for 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. That was the difference between revenge and control. Revenge wants a reaction. Control wants a calendar invite. I turned the screen off and slipped the phone away. Brandon noticed the movement and tried to smile. "Is this supposed to scare us?" I looked at him for the first time since he had started performing. Really looked at him. The expensive watch. The perfect haircut. The confidence built on rooms where nobody had ever made him prove he deserved the space he occupied. "No," I said. "You should have been scared of the audit." His smile died quietly. Claire's breath caught beside me. Richard closed his eyes for half a second, and that was all the confirmation the room needed. A murmur moved through the nearby executives, soft and nervous, spreading from table to table like a draft under closed doors. Brandon's shoulders squared. "What audit?" he asked, but the question came too fast. Too clean. Like a man asking about rain while hiding a wet umbrella. I took one step closer to the cocktail table, picked up my glass, and did not drink from it. The one reviewing the West Coast vendor contracts. The consulting fees routed through 2 shell firms in Delaware. The travel reimbursements attached to meetings that never happened. The preferred supplier agreement that somehow tripled in cost after you took over operations. The room did not gasp. Real shock rarely sounds theatrical. It sounded like chairs shifting, like a fork placed down too carefully, like people suddenly remembering every email they had ever sent. Brandon's face tightened, but he forced a laugh that fooled no one. "That is a serious accusation." "It is," I said. "That is why I did not make it until the files were complete." Claire turned fully toward him now. For the first time that night, her expression was not polished. It was searching, unsteady. "Brandon," she whispered. He did not look at her. That told her more than any answer could have. Richard finally spoke, his voice low. "Nathan, this is not the place." I nodded. "You are right. This is a gala. A room full of employees, spouses, donors, and board guests. It is not the place to settle. Governance matters." I let the word settle, then added, but it became the place when your vice president decided to turn company culture into a public execution of someone he thought had no standing. Richard flinched at the phrase, not because it was loud, but because it was accurate. Brandon's hands moved to his pockets, then back out again, as if he could not decide what innocent posture looked like. Claire looked at me, her eyes wider now, no longer embarrassed by me, but by the possibility that she had been standing beside the wrong man all evening. That was the part that landed hardest. Not the audit, not the ownership, not Richard's fear. It was watching Claire realize that she had laughed with a man who may have used her ambition as cover while dismissing the one person who had quietly kept the floor beneath her feet from collapsing. I did not enjoy that look. I thought I would, but I did not. It felt like finding water damage behind a wall you had painted yourself. You can be right and still feel the cost. Nathan, she said, softer this time. Tell me what you mean by ownership. The question hung between us, fragile and late. I looked toward Richard, and he looked away. That was answer enough. 15 years ago, I said, Vanguard Meridian was 48 hours from missing payroll. Banks had refused the bridge financing. 2 clients were preparing to pull contracts. The board had no plan except selling pieces of the company for pennies. A private entity stepped in, took the risk, carried the debt, and rebuilt the structure. Claire's lips parted. She knew the story. Everyone at Vanguard knew the polished version. A private rescue. A silent investor. A miracle nobody questioned because miracles are easier to celebrate when they do not ask for credit. That entity, I continued, was managed through my trust. The words did not echo, but they might as well have. Brandon stared at me as if I had changed shape in front of him. Claire shook her head once, tiny and automatic. No, she said, not because she knew it was false, but because the truth would rearrange too many memories. The controlling shares sit under Whitaker Meridian Holdings, I said. Marcus Hale represents the trust. Richard reports to a board that answers to it. And tomorrow morning, that board will decide how many people in this room confused arrogance with leadership. The silence came down clean. Heavy. Final. Brandon looked at Richard for rescue. Richard gave him nothing. Claire looked at me as if seeing a stranger, but that was not fair. I had always been there. She had simply preferred the smaller version of me because it made her world easier to explain. I set the glass down again, gently this time. Enjoy the rest of the evening, I said. For some of you, it is the last one that will look like this. Then I walked past Brandon, past Richard, past the tables that had laughed too easily, and for the first time all night, no one made a sound. The ballroom remained suspended in a rare stillness after I walked past the tables, the echoes of conversation and laughter lingering but muted, as if the room itself was reconsidering the evening it had hosted. Nathan Whitaker, the quiet presence all night, now held the kind of authority that required no words, no gestures, no raised voice. Claire, standing near the edge of the dance floor, finally turned to face me fully, her eyes reflecting a mixture of shock, recognition, and the faintest trace of awe. The realization that she had spent years performing beside someone whose influence she had never acknowledged settled over her like a weight, subtle but undeniable. Brandon Pierce, attempting to recover, stepped forward, but the confidence that had filled his posture earlier in the evening was now fractured, tentative. The board members and executives nearest us exchanged glances, some recalling emails, approvals, and late-night calls that suddenly aligned with the truth Nathan had quietly orchestrated. I moved with deliberate calm toward the exit, each step measured, each motion controlled, and yet the room felt my presence as if it had shifted its own center of gravity to follow me. Claire approached, her heels clicking softly against the marble, and spoke without raising her voice. Nathan, what have you done? Her words were almost a whisper, carrying more weight than any public statement. Could. I let a small smile form, calm and unassuming, and replied, I have ensured that the structure beneath this company is recognized for what it has always been. It was never about spectacle, about applause, or public perception. It was always about stability, guidance, and patience. The words settled over the room, and I could feel the subtle tension release, replaced by an understanding that authority need not be loud to be absolute. The chandeliers above scattered light like a constellation across polished floors, reflecting the faces of everyone present as they registered the quiet, measured victory that had unfolded without fanfare. Claire looked at the floor, tracing the patterns with the tip of her heel, absorbing the implications in silence. I had not humiliated her, nor had I sought revenge. The lesson was in the recognition of control and the realization that all the performances, all the assumptions, had been gently but irrevocably corrected. Brandon's shoulders slumped slightly, and he stepped back, acknowledging that his role in the evening's narrative had been recalibrated without a single overt confrontation. Richard Langford adjusted his tie, as if the physical motion might restore the composure he had momentarily lost, but the knowledge of the quiet authority in the room had already replaced the old balance of power. I allowed my gaze to sweep one last time across the ballroom, taking in the subtle reactions of everyone present. The whispers, the exchanged glances, the faint rise and fall of exhalations, all part of the unfolding acknowledgement that control had quietly shifted. Claire finally lifted her eyes to meet mine, and I could see a new understanding forming, one that did not require words. The evening had transformed from performance into revelation. Nathan Whitaker's measured patience, his quiet orchestration over years, had guided every step to this moment. The room would continue to function, to dance, to toast, and to celebrate, but the dynamic had changed permanently, subtly and undeniably, without spectacle, without the need for declaration. I offered Claire a final nod, a gesture of calm assurance that the work done quietly over years had culminated in recognition, not only of my role, but of the structure and integrity that had been invisible to everyone who assumed that appearance equaled authority. The ballroom exhaled collectively, the tension easing but the understanding remaining, permanent and unspoken. And as I moved toward the exit, each step confident, I knew that the quiet power, the patient observation, and the deliberate orchestration that had carried me here would continue to shape the space, the company, and the perception of those who had never expected the underestimated man in the corner to hold the ultimate measure of control.